ACAN are pleased to be hosting our 14th event on building with natural materials. This is a talk by Barnabas Calder about unnatural materials based on his latest book. Before we kick off, I'm sure most of you already know about ACAN and some are involved in the network. For the benefit of others in the room, I'll give a brief introduction of who we are and what we do. So for anyone new to ACAN, we're an open, voluntary network of individuals in the built environment industry. Formed in 2019, it has now grown into a global network of over 3,000 people. It started with a vision of how it could work autonomously as a collective of individuals in order to make rapid decisions and respond quickly to the climate emergency. Our manifesto has three overarching aims: decarbonise now, ecological regeneration, and cultural transformation. You can read a bit more detail about these here and on the ACAN website. ACAN is made up of many groups, including these 9 main thematic groups, of which natural materials is one. Each group is made up of individuals who want to make change happen, and a couple of people from each group take a coordination role to help facilitate the group and any actions. You can hear more about what else is going on in the other groups by joining ACAN, and we'll share a link to the other groups in the chat box. I'll now hand over to Anna to introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Andy. So ACAN Natural Materials Group are delighted to welcome Dr. Barnabas Calder this evening. Barnabas teaches at the University of Liverpool and he is a historian of architecture, specialising in the relationship between architecture and energy throughout human history. He also focuses research on British architecture since 1945 and he is a trustee of the Society of Architectural Historians of Great Britain. His most recent book, Architecture from Prehistory to Climate Emergency, was published in 2021 and has been hailed as one of the most significant architectural publications of recent years. It's currently in the process of being translated into Italian, Turkish, Japanese, and Chinese. So this evening, Barnabas will be talking to us about his book and how the rise of fossil fuels has produced today's architectural norms and the materials palette that we're so used to using. He will discuss the potential of history to help us steer a path out of the worst impacts of climate change. If you have any questions whilst Barnabas is talking, please add them to the chat and we'll address them at the end of Barnabas's talk. So Barnabas, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for a very generous introduction as usual, Anna. And thank you all ever so much for giving up on a beautiful evening to be indoors on a Zoom after so many Zooms. I'm deeply honoured by your presence. This is a house in the western Amazon state of Rondonia, in the Tunaru indigenous territory. And it is the house that was lived in at the time of his death by a man widely summed up as the last member of his tribe. His fellow group members were probably murdered in the 1970s by killers hired by colonists or ranchers who were wanting to appropriate their land. But the last member of the group died only last year, living in this house. This was the last of around 50 houses that he built and lived in that period. And it will disappear rapidly now that he's dead, leaving no or almost no trace. The specific home is highly individual and specific in its details and in its particular palette of materials, but at the same time, it's typical of certain general tendencies in the habitations of most people who have ever lived. It's made of natural materials, processed as little as possible. Those materials are obtained as close to the site as possible, a matter of meters, not kilometers. It's the size it needs to be for his requirements, and that size is remarkably consistent across hunter-gatherer and agrarian cultures for all but a small elite. It is, in fact, completely circular as a house. That complete circularity, the ability to return entirely to nature if and when it's no longer needed, it's that makes this house a useful contemporary representation of a housing type, variations, infinite variations on which go back probably pretty much to the beginning of our species. We are almost certainly missing hundreds of thousands of years of human architecture from the archaeological record, precisely because this building will be untraceable within 50 years, never mind 150,000 years. So it's only for about the last 15,000 years that we have any indications of what humans have been building, precisely because of our penchant for natural materials, our absolute default to natural materials that disappear again at the end of their life in a way that we now once again recognize as a very good thing. The earliest buildings that do leave traces do so because of exceptional circumstances. Amongst them, ooh, what's going on there? There seems to be the ghost of an old talk recurring on. I'll advance past the slide. This is a house made of mammoth bones by people who traveled to the frozen tundra of Ice Age Ukraine about 15 to 20,000 years ago to hunt animals for their food energy and their heat energy. They burnt mammoth bones for warmth and to cook on, and they built the house from the energy leftovers to retain the heat energy from that precious fire. So the primitive hut that European architectural theorists have obsessed about for centuries turns out actually to be built from energy byproducts and built to retain energy in a place that they've gone to pursue energy resources. Energy has been the keynote of architecture as far back as we can trace. And vernacular architectures ever since then, and probably long before, of both hunter-gatherers and of non-elite farming people around the world have always had these functions of controlling energy use, keeping you warm or cool depending on what the threats are of your climate, using minimum energy inputs, and using materials that are as natural as possible and require a minimum of transport energy. And transport energy is important because in the European Middle Ages, to give you a sense of the transport of cost before fossil fuels, stone would typically double in price if you transported it only 20 kilometers by road from the quarry. So transport was extremely expensive, extremely difficult, extremely grueling, given the weight of building materials. So natural materials sourced very, very locally were the only game in town for almost all human building before fossil fuels. Even the exceptions reinforce this picture. Stonehenge famously includes some smaller bluestone blocks that have come all the way from southwest Wales. But their transport wasn't because that was the easiest way of doing the job. It was because it was an act of piety and the conspicuous consumption of human energy to get them there. In Rome too, we see conspicuous consumption of transport. The columns at the front of the Pantheon in the bottom of this image, and the marbles and other beautiful building stones on the interior of this building, built by successively Trajan and Hadrian, emperors of Rome, is an absolute explosion of exotic stones, prestigious precisely because they showed the overcoming of a massive technical challenge, transporting building materials a long way. Even with this spectacular display of transport of heavy stuff, Roman imperial projects were actually much lower in their transport requirements than they want you to think. In the case of the Baths of Caracalla, which has been subject to a superb kind of reverse quantity surveying operation by the wonderful Janet Delane at Oxford, it turns out that only 0.5% of the volume of the building was made up of its ostentatious marble cladding. And processing of materials too is much lighter in Roman context than you would think from the famous use of concrete in this building and others. Roman stonemasons cut their blocks of stone into very thin cladding panels using water mills and used their heat inputs as lightly as they possibly could. Only 6% of the baths of Caracalla was made up of the materials that received heat processing, lime and fired brick. The whole of the rest was materials used as found, and 76% of the volume of those materials came from within 20 kilometers of the site, despite the fact that it was built right in the center of the world's biggest ever city up to that date, during an enormous building boom and at the tail end of centuries of enormous building boom. Still, you could use 76% of your materials coming from within 20 kilometers. Compare that with today's buildings, and it's extraordinarily transport light and heat light. Farming societies all shared these tendency to avoid heat inputs unless you were showing off spectacularly through heat inputs, as in, for example, the mosques of Persia with their fired ceramic tiles. Trees were really slow growing, and firewood took up land you could otherwise use for growing food or growing structural timber. So you just didn't use heat for architecture if you could help it. What they did have as a cheap exploitable resource, if you were an elite figure in an agrarian society, was cheap labor. The horrific hierarchies of the agrarian world allowed the patrons of the absurd overscaled buildings on this slide. Our mammoth bone house is at the top left for purposes of comparison. These illustrations by Gingerhead for my book. And you could build on an enormous scale. So here we have the Pantheon, we have 3 of the French medieval cathedrals, and we have obviously the Pyramid of Khufu, the biggest of the Egyptian pyramids, as the largest by far of these buildings, and one of the biggest buildings ever built. And it cost 78 million days of labor for Khufu's people to stack up this much stone. Somewhere well over 5 million tons of stone, 78 million days of human labor. Yet when you add up all of that energy input from labor, it turns out to be only the same energy cost in human labor as the heat energy cost of making the iron for the Eiffel Tower. Or to put the same energy figure into terms of human energy consumption as individuals, any 7 average Americans today will, in an average American lifespan, consume more energy than it cost to build the Pyramid of Khufu. We are today living in conditions where ordinary people around much of the world are more energy rich than the most powerful people of the ancient world. In terms of what you could build and run for 50 years today for the same energy cost as the building the Pyramid of Khufu, this is about the size you're looking at, shown here to, oops, let me make sure the slides are advancing for you. This is the size, about 4,500 square meters of average building today. You can build and run it for 50 years for the cost of the Pyramid of Khufu. Here it is next to the Pyramid of Khufu, and bear in mind how deep the Pyramid of Khufu is, as well as how high and how wide, to get a sense of how much smaller an amount of building we get using our deeply unnatural materials and our extraordinarily profligate ideas of what we have to have in the way of comfort. And the tipping point that gave rise to this great move away from natural materials was the rise of fossil fuels. This is a building built partly on the proceeds of fossil fuels, Hardwick Hall in Derbyshire, where Bess of Hardwick owned coal mines as part of her property portfolio of things, generally speaking, looted from the monasteries a couple of decades earlier by some of her husbands. And Bess of Hardwick built this as the most flamboyantly impressive house one of the most flamboyantly impressive houses of her entire generation, and its most famous feature is the sheer size of its windows. And window glass, of course, is enormously energy hungry to produce. She produced it, however, using wood heat, because the technical challenges of producing glass using coal heat had not yet been overcome. It was to be about another 2 decades before that was to be achieved. And so at this stage, the glass is produced using wood heat, and the quality is unbelievably poor. For somebody so prestigious, most of the glass has been replaced, but in the places where it hasn't, someone that prestigious and rich living with windows as unilluminating as this and as discolored as this and as full of bubbles and distortions as this is an extraordinary sign of the extent to which natural materials and the limits of circularity and sustainable energy supplies in pre-fossil fuel conditions really did limit the quality of more heat intense materials, because you just didn't build up a big enough industry to do better. Within just decades of the transfer to coal glass, window pane sizes shoot up and their optical quality becomes unrecognizably superior. The Georgian house is the first systematically fossil fuel dependent building type. And it always amuses me when the British war between traditionalists and modernists takes the side of Georgian houses, because Georgian houses are so clearly more closely related to brutalist architecture than they are to vernacular architecture. They are an entirely fossil fuel building type. Fossil fuel, coal fired bricks, coal fired glass, coal smelted iron railings, and from 1801 onwards, coal gas lighting outside, and heated by large coal fires in lots of different rooms. And you can see the chimneys along the top that reflect the need to get all of that filthy, stinking, sulfurous smoke out of the house safely. So this is the moment of transition in this country and the start of a worldwide transition to fossil fuel modernity. And it costs an enormous amount of coal. William Cavett has done the maths for the reconstruction of the City of London after the Great Fire of 1666 and suggests that it took about 500 million bricks fired by burning 70,000 tons of coal. The lime for the mortar that joined them would have added half as much again in coal consumption, and more than that in carbon, thanks to the calcination of the lime. So that's well over 300,000 tons of sooty carbon dioxide belching out into the suburban skies of London over the course of the reconstruction of the City of London to be a fireproof fossil fuel city. And that process just snowballed and snowballed. So in 1829, it was still a source of significant concern, the extent to which London was sprawling out into the countryside around. George Cruikshank drew this wonderful kind of depiction of urban development as a war on the countryside, with the brick kilns firing the bricks at the haystacks, the lime being riddled to take the lumps out of it in the center of the image, with what looks like the smoke of musketry, but is actually lime powder drifting off and killing the ancient trees, which are crying out in distress as the dodgy jerry-built housing strides into war behind them. And even by the time Christopher Wren was designing the St. Paul's Cathedral, they knew that it would be blackened by the smoke of the coal that paid for it. It was paid for by a tax on coal importation to London, and they knew well enough that it would be blackened by the coal to mean that they chose Portland stone because it had performed relatively well on the banqueting house of Inigo Jones in the face of existing coal pollution. It seems almost inappropriate to have cleaned St. Paul's. It earned its smoke. And transport costs, once the railways get going using fossil fuel heat, are the next thing to collapse. So by the 19th century, by the later 19th century, you have transport being so cheap that here in Liverpool, people are building terraces of ordinary housing using Bedfordshire bricks, not for any difference in their properties other than the fact that the yellow colour was an exciting tweak to the architecture, whilst meanwhile in London, they were building red brick from the Midlands and the North, equally just because it was exotic. I have this sort of mental image of somewhere around the 1870s, two trains passing each other somewhere like Crewe, with red bricks going south and identical in size and technical properties, yellow bricks trundling north, just for the pleasure of having a different color. You can't begin to imagine people doing anything so insanely profligate without the fossil fuel inputs for those cheap trains. This results in a kind of growing cult of permanence. Victorian architecture is the high point of this move, I would suggest. But it starts with Georgian architecture and this real technical improvement that comes with brick, with fired brick, that it is very fireproof and very much better at deterring unwanted biodiversity in the form of vermin than wattle and daub housing had been. But this obsession with permanence comes at an enormous energy cost, so that for a building like the Natural History Museum here by Waterhouse, you're looking at an interior where, as far as I can see, not a single thing you can see there, with the possible exception of the tops of the stair claddings, is a natural material. Everything in this image is either terracotta, fired and then refired with a glaze on it, or glass, or cast iron, or paint. All of them highly industrialized materials with the goal of never ever coming to an end. And all of this requiring enormous heat inputs to secure. And this cult of permanence ends up producing a new feature of the built environment, which is the deliberate seeking out of toxins to add to building products. So things like this charming frilly Victorian station canopy, of a sort familiar to anyone who ever travels by train anywhere in this country probably, is painted when it's new in lead paint. And that lead is not an unfortunate side effect. Its toxicity is central to its functionality. It is there to slow down the cycle of maintenance, to kill things so that they don't harm the wood. So high fossil fuel energy inputs and toxicity were sought out in order to make things as unnatural as you could, as in order that they would endure. This is the remains, or the scar left by a French combined gold and arsenic mining operation. Both of them sought out for their relationship to naturalness, that gold will never decay and arsenic will slow down decay by poisoning things. So from 1933 onwards, much wood for outdoor purposes has been treated, even up till today in much of the world, with chromated copper arsenate, which is an intense poison added to wood in order to reduce the need to detail it to survive, or that reduce the need to maintain and replace it. Poisons, in other words, are dug from deep, deep beneath the earth where they were doing no harm and deliberately put into circulation in the environment in order to save on maintenance. And this kind of obsessive desire to get away from the natural peaks in the 20th century with modernism. Le Corbusier writes in Towards an Architecture, the most influential architectural book of the 20th century. He writes that steel girders and more recently reinforced concrete are pure manifestations of calculation. Whereas in the old world timber beam, there may be lurking some treacherous knot. natural materials are suspicious, untrustworthy, unreliable, can't be calculated with the pure elegance that he's after. He goes on to say, massive timbers, as thick as you please and heavy for all eternity, will spring and split if placed near a radiator, whilst a patent board 1 inch thick will remain intact. Now, you might object that putting a radiator next to a beam is where the problem arises here, but for Le Corbusier, the problem is using suspicious old natural materials. And if we could only get fully away from them to an entirely industrial palette of materials, the world would be a better place. It's a sort of OCD in his case, but it's very, very widespread. And the world he proposes in his villas and his photography of those villas is a world where all materials are unnatural and where everything is run on these intense fossil fuel inputs. He took this photo and he published this photo, which looks like the most boring photo of the bits you ignore of a building. And no architect today would take a photo of the equivalent exposed servicing in their buildings. But here, he is so fiercely proud of the ways in which fossil fuel inputs are changing architecture that he chooses to take a photo of the oil tanks and the electrical exchange area. Inside his houses, industrial materials are everywhere, and heat leaks out all over the place because his 5 points of a new architecture that are these celebrated manifesto points about how modernism should look are all dependent on the unnaturalness of the materials, the use of steel and concrete, and on what he himself called superabundant heat inputs through fossil fuels. So the free plan, free elevation, and roof gardens and pilotis, the standing of building on columns that are all exhibited in this famous room in the Villa Savoie, mean that there is no wall in this photo that goes on, and no ceiling and no floor that goes on to another interior. That is all going straight to outdoors, and heat therefore leaks through it with incredible profligacy. And this is where his freedom is coming from. All these new freedoms are coming from powerful fossil-fueled central heating. You see the same at the Bauhaus, where Gropius designs an art school that will embody the qualities of the new materials, steel, glass, concrete, by allowing the workshops where the students work to be entirely transparent, outdoors and indoors separated only by a membrane of glass. It's beautiful. It's still taught as an iconic piece of the formative architecture of our buildings today. And yet this building performs so badly thermally that by the 1970s, after about 6 boiler replacements, Daniel Barber has done a wonderful history of this building's boiler house, and it's one of the best pieces of architectural history I've read. I strongly recommend it, called Heating the Bauhaus. And it describes this series of exploding boilers and boiler failures, and its installation of more and more and more boilers, and the employment of more and more boiler men to keep shoveling the coal into them. Even so, one winter, the heating pipes froze while the heating was on. That's how badly this building performs in thermal terms. And you don't hear that from anyone other than Daniel Barber. You get it taught as being an important influence on architecture today. And it is an important influence on architecture today, but a totally catastrophic one. The actual workshops are now disused because they've done an energy retrofit to the building, and they couldn't replace the glazing because it's so world important, but they also couldn't heat the building well enough to use it with that glazing, so they've just abandoned it. It's a monument to the modernism's terrible attitude to energy. By the 1940s, Pietro Belluschi in America was working on trying to develop an aluminium structural frame because it would use more energy to produce. And the reason for that is that there was a concern that the American economy would suffer from peace when the aircraft manufacturing of the wartime stopped and all that aluminium demand went. And therefore, he was trying to find new uses for aluminium, to use aluminium just because it would keep the economy ticking over. It's a terrifying example of the thinking that's basically still dominating today. Luckily, it turned out to be technically unfeasible. But Mies van der Rohe's example turned out to be very followable. This is a detail of his famous Seagram building in New York, which shows the way in which single glazed, uninsulated windows meet highly conductive brass mullions in a way where if you were trying to lose heat from this building in winter and trying to gain sun heat in summer, you would design it like this. It is terrifyingly profligate. And in later life, Mies was having a conversation with a friend about architecture and said that he felt that it was the engineer's job to make heat go where it was supposed to go, not the architect's job, which is an absolutely terrifying statement of a particular modernist ethos. This peaks probably in the 1960s with people like Cedric Price, whose Fun Palace scheme is seen here, typically viewed from a helicopter because it's always nice to find another way of getting some fossil fuels burnt. And this building is only the most lasting bits of this building were supposed to rust away catastrophically within 10 years, so that the building had to be demolished, because Price felt that permanence in buildings was a source of constriction to their users. And it's true. We lecture in universities, for example, largely these days, I feel sometimes because we have lecture theatres rather than because it's a particularly good format. He felt that that kind of restriction was bad enough to mean that buildings should all be demolished every 10 years so that you only ever built what you really needed. But what an insanely energy hungry thing to do. And this building, in order to keep its flexibility, proposes that most of the elements in it will be canvas enclosures heated by blowing warm air into them all the time. Some of them are open-sided, and you just blow the warm air into their general direction in the hope that people will remain comfortable if you blow enough of it. Buckminster Fuller, a big influence on high-tech architecture, described buildings as fancy nozzles through which to spray energy services. This sounds quite mad from today's ears, I hope. But when you look at the period leading up to this on a chart of energy in England, you can see that this is the end of a period of exponential energy rise. Cheap coal is joined by cheap oil and then cheaper Arabian oil in the post-war period, to mean that as the high-tech architects have their fantasies of what the world is going to be like soon, they're looking at a rate of change in technology and society supported by that energy rise that looks as though it's rising exponentially again, as it did throughout the 19th century. And at that point, the walking cities and other mad fantasies of that period might have become real. Then, as now, the belief was that fusion power would be making energy cheap and clean within 10 years. The fact that they already thought it then may warn us that we need to not depend too strongly on it now as the thing that's going to rescue us from climate emergency. And it's only the oil crises of the 1970s and the failure of fusion power to emerge that results in high-tech architecture looking as strange and as orphaned in its most extreme 1960s forms as it does. So, where are we now? We talk all the time about sustainability in architecture, but are we actually doing better than the 1960s? Well, the hoarding says so, but the building behind it says no. And in fact, I would suggest that we're at a new worst of both worlds, influenced partly by high-tech architecture's thinking about disposability and partly just by the simple economics of the buildings and materials industries. We are now in a state where we keep the energy intense manufacturing methods that we started in Victorian times, but we replace incredibly quickly and we throw away incredibly quickly. So many agrarian building materials are objected to, many zero carbon building materials of the past are objected to because of their short lifetime. And yet we throw out our durable materials far faster than low energy materials would need to be replaced. Sanitary fittings that might last 2 centuries fill skips demoralizingly rapidly, accompanied by other hard to dispose of components like plasterboards, plastics, and tiles. Even the facades of our buildings today are using materials like aluminium, which potentially could last a long time, but at an enormous energy cost. It's one of the most energy hungry of all building materials, and we are using it in a way that does not last by choice. We are gluing it together into these incredibly highly processed, deeply unnatural manufactured boards with layer after layer after layer of different stuff in them. The manufacturers say that it is possible to 100% recycle these materials. It's certainly not possible to without substantial energy inputs, and polyethylene, which is the core of many of them, is only recyclable a few times before it degrades significantly. But the key thing for me is that this, on the same web page, declares that the manufacturer's ACP aluminium composite sheets come with a warranty of 10 to 20 years with proper maintenance. How does that compare to traditional materials which get rejected for their short lifespan? This is the traditional material par excellence of roofing in much of human history, thatch. How does an aluminium composite board compare? Well, thatched roofs can last 60 years, provided you replace the ridge every 15 years or so. So this offers a far better lifespan than the aluminium claddings we're using on our buildings. It also offers better thermal properties, a vastly better carbon profile, full circularity, that rather than having to chop it up and electrostatically separate the bits, you just take it off and put it back on the soil and it returns to the soil. It offers carbon sequestration, takes carbon out of the air and stores it as thatched roof. And as we've tragically seen in multiple incidents, the most grotesquely tragic of which was Grenfell Tower, of course, the fire properties of many aluminium cladding materials are murderously poor. Thatch would actually have burnt slower and released less poison than the high technology cladding that was used on Grenfell Tower. So what are we getting for the incredible energy inputs that we put into making these materials and the incredible amounts of pollution they produce? The answer seems to be financial profit for some, and a definition of performance that I don't think is worth having in the first place. This is perhaps the quintessential 21st century space. The absolutely bland international hotel room with an air conditioning unit on one side and the curtains shut and lights on all the time. It's 22 degrees all the time, whatever the climate outside, wherever in the world it is, whatever season it is. The air is odorless, characterless, has no sense of the seasons, no sense of the geography of where you are. Any hotel chain would do for this image. I'm not picking on one, but that's the whole point, that they're absolutely interchangeable globally. They're part of the aggressive marketing of Western norms of intense fossil fuel consumption to the world. We shouldn't be crashing in with our high energy solutions to the rest of the world, because we know now that they're undermining the livability of our planet at a terrifying speed. We should be listening to the rest of the world and looking back at low carbon vernaculars. And this is a message that does seem to be gaining purchase. Norman Foster has been a prominent critic of much sustainable thought recently, but he came out in this last few days while I was preparing for this talk and said that basic buildings created without architects, constructed with local materials and passive design strategies can serve as a valuable reference point for the industry. How cheering. Battle over, right? Well, possibly not entirely. This is the building he was talking about. It's built by his foundation, working with Holcim, who call themselves a materials company, building materials company now, though I think cement company would have been the definition until that became an increasingly toxic brand. And it's a new prototype for emergency housing using a canvas enclosure impregnated with cement so that you put it up, wet it, and it turns into concrete. It's attractively and intelligently designed, as you'd expect from the Foster Foundation, and would certainly be far nicer than a tent to live in medium term. And it uses low carbon concrete, which Holcim is very proud of. Is that the answer to the criticisms of unnatural materials? Well, Holcim's own account of what they mean by low carbon concrete is at least 30% lower CO2 emissions compared to standard concrete. Given that in 2015 they sold 256 million tons of cement, which amounts to a carbon output probably equivalent to about half that of aviation that year. 30% savings is well worth having, but it's not enough to make the world's cement production sustainable, even if all concrete moved over to Eco-Pact, which it hasn't. But it's not just its cement carbon emissions that I would quibble with about this project's learning from low carbon vernaculars. If you compare it to the work of Yasmin Lari, who recently and wonderfully won the RIBA's Royal Gold Medal, she has been working with villages displaced by flooding in some of the poorest areas of Pakistan. And if we compare her emergency housing with the Foster Foundation and Holcim's, hers is produced without waiting for initiatives from central organizations. They're built when and where the villagers need them. They're funded very locally and cheaply, as opposed to being parachuted in as rich world charitability. Lari's work intentionally spreads local skills and the ability to teach them onwards for small payments from neighbors, as opposed to explicitly setting out to avoid dependence on local skill, as the Foster Project does. Lari's work generates self-confidence and self-dependence through helping people to craft things themselves, as against generating further dependence in that very difficult post-disaster, aid-driven environment. And it develops a local economy rather than making people dependent on things brought in from outside. It snowballs by local people teaching each other, rather than stopping dead when the last NGO helicopter and jeep leave. And what happens in 10 years' time or 20? Who in the West, let alone in a disaster-struck village, knows how to repair concrete impregnated canvas when it starts to go wrong? Who knows how to recognize if it's become dangerously unstable with age? How do you go about disposing of it when its lifespan is over? Lari's buildings, if they stop being useful, will disappear back into the soil from which they rose. And meanwhile, they can be maintained, replaced, extended, altered, repaired by people who built them using the same set of skills and the same set of materials that they have available locally. It's skills, not buildings, that she's truly giving people or helping people to give each other. And the housing is the product of those skills. It's a byproduct almost of this change to people's confidence and economic engagement. They don't have to get external funding or materials or other things that they can't afford locally. She is truly teaching people to fish rather than dumping a crate of frozen fish fingers on them from 20,000 feet. The standard aid-driven model for emergency housing is heartbreakingly dependent on the unreliable news spotlight, a burst of aid spending after a disaster, which then dries up rapidly without proper follow-through when international attention wanders elsewhere. And mistakes made in this kind of way with industrial materials and techniques linger in materials that refuse to rot, or if they do manage to rot, they poison the soil as they do so. Whereas low-carbon vernaculars disappear harmlessly and rapidly back into the soil as soon as they're no longer needed. The important early 20th century French architect Auguste Perret said that architecture is what makes beautiful ruins. Truly sustainable architecture leaves no ruins at all. So we have to start recognizing a simple fundamental truth, that we have far more to learn about architecture from Indonesia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Pakistan, and many other of the world's least affluent regions than they have to learn from us. In England in particular, we have the longest architectural dependency on fossil fuels of anywhere in the world. We know least of anyone in the world about how to build and maintain zero carbon architecture using local natural materials to create comfort with minimal energy inputs. And you in the ACAN Natural Materials Group are fighting back against this better than anyone else. And I hugely admire your work, but you are in the worst country you could be doing this in, arguably. America's a good competition. I'd like to finish with a note of hope, which is that human beings have always, for as far back as I can trace, and this is the subject of my next book, used culture to restrain their overexploitation of vulnerable, crucial resources. This is an Inuit family, and the Inuit are a particularly clear example of it because of how extreme the environment is in which they live. But their traditional way of life was extraordinarily elegantly constructed to coexist with slow breeding, hard to hunt large animals in a very, very extreme environment. And their culture gave this wonderful support to self-restraint on population size, to absolute hatred of wastefulness, and to massive stigmatization of refusal to share with other people when they had need and you had something. And these critical ecological and social values don't align with crude self-interest, but work well for the group, and therefore culture is needed to inculcate the willingness and the eagerness to do the right thing, even when it's not in your most straightforward, crude self-interest. And humans have always had mechanisms for avoiding overexploiting their critical resources to a point of collapse through these cultural methods. We are in a weird position where we've just realized that we're not doing that. But the more we come out of denial, the more we start to see, I suspect almost everyone in this conversation today has a different view of concrete to the one they had 20 years ago. I bet many of you thought that new concrete was beautiful 20 years ago. I certainly did. And now I see it and wince. And that genuine cultural change in each of us moving at a different speed will help us to rescue ourselves from the abyss on the edge of which we currently stand, provided we can avoid a culture war effect of Moriarty and Holmes tumbling into the Reichenbach Falls, wrestling with each other because the environment has become an issue of left-right polarization and Fox Newsism. So if we can avoid that and keep calmly helping people to understand in the way that I think ACAN does better than anyone else, we can save this situation. And natural materials are right at the heart of that battle. So I'll shut up now and we'll talk. And I'm very keen to hear what you have to say. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Barnabas. That was wonderful. We don't have any questions at the moment. I've been encouraging people to put some questions in. So I'm going to start with, well, we've been thinking about things in the background while you're talking, but some questions are really big, I think, when it comes to what you've been talking about, and some are quite small. So I might start with perhaps a big one, which is something that I've been thinking about in relation to how I teach at university. I suppose, to what extent do you feel that modernism has maybe disconnected humans from the awareness that we are nature and that we don't exist outside nature, but that we are actually a part of nature? And that as a result of that, we have disconnected and lost awareness of the seasons. We don't live as seasonally, and we have very different expectations of comfort that are perhaps wildly out of kilter with reality. Just wondered what you thought about that.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think comfort, like money and student feedback, are things that people always think they want more of. And the reality is more complicated than that. And if you think about the costs of them in fundamental ways, you get to a different kind of sense of the ways in which they're a good thing and the ways in which they're a problematic thing. So the modernism is definitely a part of that great move away from the kind of sense of seasonality and balance that that we need to rediscover. The desire not to be part of nature goes back a lot further. It's certainly widespread amongst agrarian societies that you have a much harsher sense of the difference between humanity and other animals and plants than hunter-gatherers typically do, for example, where hunter-gatherers, well, for example, the Inuit, as I was mentioning them before, had a belief that animals had immortal souls, as did humans. And the implications of that for humans are that there's a finite number of immortal souls to go around, and the name of the last person to die goes to the next person to be born, and you keep your replacement rate as close as you can to your dying off rate in order to make sure that your group size doesn't increase to an unsustainable extent or drop to an unsustainable extent. And meanwhile, animals have immortal souls, which means that if you mistreat them, which can include wasting some of them as food or not being willing to share them with another person in hunger, then the immortal soul of the animal will go back and warn other animals not to be hunted by you, which isn't a good explanation of the phenomenon from a scientific point of view today, we wouldn't think, but is a very good way of helping to link long-term consequences through a story that kind of makes intuitive sense and makes emotional sense, so that the outcomes of it are exactly right, that you share and you don't waste. And whether or not the animal has an immortal soul and can report back to the other animals, we can of course never know for sure. But it's a more useful belief than the kind of Judeo-Christian belief, which is more typical of agrarian societies, that God put us in charge of animals and gave us animals as our playthings and our tools. But it's a very conventional farming belief, and animals get categorized into the useful ones and the awful ones, and you make the awful ones as extinct as you can, as quickly as you can, and
they also don't go to heaven, so they're not as important. They're not going to heaven. Yeah,
exactly.
So yeah, that's really interesting. We've got some questions appearing now, which is great. So I'm going to just start working my way through them. So thank you to Sophia. How do you challenge what is expected of you from the public or the architecture profession as an architect in the West? Because the way that we're living now, dense populations in cities, does not make it easy to go back to thatch roofs and natural architecture. So is it more about changing how we live?
Yeah. Thank you. That's the
it's a good one.
That is obviously the great challenge. put your finger exactly on it. Personally, my solution is to be an architectural historian, and therefore I can sort of identify a goal and close the Zoom window. But yes, it's obviously the great challenge. I'm not suggesting either that we do go back in a kind of crude way to exactly how things were in the past. If you switched off all our fossil fuels tomorrow, we would still be the second most energy-rich society ever to exist through our renewables. And renewables make an enormous difference against agrarian and hunter-gatherer times in the amount of energy and the usefulness or the versatility of that energy that we have available to us. So it's not as simple as going backwards. The reason I emphasize the past is partly, I guess, because as a historian, it's sort of where my brain tends to go to and where my research tends to lie. But it's also that I think there's something very encouraging for us in the architectural world about the difference between the other major emitters and us. We're 40% of all human emissions. The aviation industry is a much smaller proportion, but it has a bigger problem that there has never been a zero carbon flight. Aviation came about because of cheap petrochemical fuels in liquid form. Until then, you could think ever so cleverly about it, as Leonardo did, but humans weren't strong enough to make his airplanes fly, and so they were just a doodle in a book. Whereas within 2 decades of kerosene becoming cheaply available and refined enough, you have powered flight. And it is born into fossil fuels because fossil fuels' extraordinary energy density and ability to flow in the form of oil and gas is unique and spectacular and very hard to replace. We don't have that problem. We've got thousands of years of zero carbon precedent at all scales of grandeur and all scales of permanence as well. You know, you can do it zero carbon. You can build very.
I was going to say that because with this question, Sophia, you're saying about changing how we live, and yes, there is that, but we can build tall buildings in timber. They exist, but not necessarily in the UK. The tallest timber building is in Norway at the moment, and it's 85 meters tall. So it doesn't mean that we have to not live densely in a city. It's about shifting the use of the materials, I think, and being brave to try that. Is it okay if I move on to the next question, because we've got lots now that I'm piling in?
Of course.
Is that okay?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, so right, Joseph says, I have a question about retrofitting existing buildings. I know, Barnabas, you'll be doing that with your house to improve energy performance. Is what the government has committed to enough? And if not, how could it be done better?
Yeah, it's one of the great challenges, and it's also one of the great challenges for natural materials, because the ways it tends to be done is very, very plasticky, which is hugely problematic, and both in terms of the embodied energy of the plastic insulation materials and in terms of what happens to them at the end of their life, and often in terms of the ways in which they interact with the natural moisture patterns of older buildings. So they can be devastatingly damaging to a building and ineffective in their goals.
I think that's going to happen next, isn't it? It'll be mold next, probably.
It's a big mold is a big challenge with badly implemented insulation in almost any existing building. So what the government is currently doing is basically nothing, and that's devastatingly awful. It's very hard to see how to do it. Our plan for our house, which is a typical Edwardian terrace, was to do a kind of deep retrofit, and this past winter, because we haven't been able to afford more than a tiny bit of that work so far, it's very expensive. This past winter, we just decided to see how low we could keep the heating. We got 2 small children, and we managed to keep it to 15.5 almost throughout the winter. We aired it in the slightly warmer times of day to avoid damp problems, and it was absolutely fine. We haven't had any mold, and we didn't get any health problems from it. And we wore thermal onesies throughout the winter, and it was fine. And so I think part of the solution is to change our expectations of comfort significantly. So if you are in a hot place, you turn the air conditioning to a much higher temperature so that it just takes the edge off. And if you're in a cold place, you turn the heating down to the level where it only just takes the edge off. Before I had children, I lived in an ill-insulated or an uninsulated flat with huge old windows, and I didn't heat it at all, and it would drop to 8 degrees in winter, and I survived that fine too. We can live with much less extreme levels of comfort than we seem to feel are necessary, and that hugely reduces the need for retrofit. The other thing is to think about intermittency. That the great problem with replacing heating and cooling using renewables is that renewables come and go with the weather. But the answer to that for me is to move to knowing that if it's a particularly cold, still night in winter, where there therefore isn't any wind power, isn't any solar power, your heating will be off because it's electric heating, running only off renewables, and you just deal with that. And you have a horribly cold night, and then you look forward to the next day when the solar comes back and your house gets a bit warmer. And that the whole of the rest of human history, people have had to deal with the weather affecting their comfort conditions. It's a weird assumption that we can or should fully get rid of that. So I think there's a big cultural change and a medium-sized technical change required to improve building.
I'm gonna have to ask you about passive house and Enefit off the back of that statement, because obviously that's about maintaining comfort to a certain level with a lot of research. So I agree with you. It's important to maybe feel and behave and live more seasonally. But I live in an old house too, and I think we got down to 14 in the winter as well. And actually, it's fine. Got used to it. Just our visitors didn't. But what do you feel about passive house and Enefit in that regard?
Yeah, I think increasingly my view on them has changed. I think they're admirable, and I think the work they've done is superb on working out how you make contemporary comfort norms as low energy as possible. But I think they're aiming for too high a level of comfort. I think they're aiming too warm, to achieve too much warmth passively, and that you could put quite a lot less plastics into most of them and cost less to build them. And you could retrofit more easily if you set the bar a bit lower, both in terms of how much you keep the same energy inputs that they're aiming for, namely almost none for heating, but radically reduce the comfort expectations that are attached to it. You save an awful lot of money and energy very quickly.
Okay, we need to keep going because the questions are stacking up here. And okay, so thanks for that one, Joseph. We've now got Kieran, who has asked, what do you suggest a natural material based building looks like in the UK when you need to achieve fire performance, thermal performance, fair pay, housing demand, poverty, etc., etc.? What does a natural material building look like to you?
Yeah, it's a really tricky one, isn't it? I think the answer is partly that some of our expectations about building performance and regulation and insurance need to change, because they're based on the assumption our regulations have all come about in the centuries of fossil fuel dominance, and therefore they're all designed around the assumption of intense fossil fuel inputs for our materials and our technologies, and therefore the regulations need to change to allow, for example, lower thermal performance in some respects, or lower comfort conditions, perhaps different expectations of fire performance where you concentrate on human safety rather than on preservation of property in some cases, perhaps different ways of thinking about how and what we retrofit, which I think is a huge part of it. So the most natural material for a building in the UK is an existing building in most cases, because we've got a super abundance of them, and our population isn't rising very fast. So they're not necessarily in the right places and functions, but we have an enormous amount of building stock that's reusable, and we're demolishing a huge amount of it every year, which is incredibly wasteful. So it's a really tricky set of challenges, but we definitely need people in this conversation today and this meeting today who aren't architects to be voting and informing friends about this situation, so that we all get governments to take effective action on the ways in which regulation is forcing our hands into higher carbon solutions.
Okay. We haven't quite said what a natural based materials building would look like in that answer, but it was still a good answer.
It would look like a building that was already there with a wooden roof extension.
Okay, fine. Thanks. So the next question is Anzir, or Anzir, sorry if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. The growth of many cities at the moment is such that local material sourcing is difficult, even for self-built basic housing. How do we begin to look at how cities in rapidly growing parts of the world can develop in less damaging ways? They're really great questions.
Yeah. It's a really good question, yeah. The reason why Rome is so encouraging is that it grew at a speed that doesn't match contemporary mega city growth, but was extraordinarily fast and spectacular, and they managed to source their materials almost exclusively from within very short distance. Because if you look back to what the vernaculars were in a given area, then they are things that either grow or geologically occur very nearby, and they tend to be, at least to some degree, scalable. So if it's timber, it takes a long time to scale it, and that's a problem. If it's stone, you can scale stone production extremely quickly. There are objections from some people about the effects of quarrying, but we're quarrying it anyway for concrete, and then we're turning 40% of it into carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Whereas if you quarry it and build with it, you keep the whole quantity of it. And you can do it relatively locally. In most places on Earth, there's stone fairly locally and scalably. And the cost of stone that's very high at the moment is because it's a cosmetic luxury material, where therefore what it looks like is seen as very important. When you stop caring about that, there's an awful lot more usable stone, which just has what is seen as cosmetic flaws. So that's a big part of it, I think. Bamboo too is very quick growing in large parts of the world where cities are growing fastest. You can grow bamboo very quickly, and it's a fabulous building material. So there are different solutions in different places, and part of the story of natural materials is that they are very different depending on where you are and what climates you're dealing with. But if you look back in time in any place, you can get a sense of the passive strategies and the material palette that will help to rescue you from the problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Okay, the next question is from John, who says, might you have something to say about why hemp was so demonized and remains fringe despite the enormity of knowledge and research compiled in recent years?
I think there is a fight back against natural materials from the unnatural materials industry, and
Definitely.
a kind of a caution about adopting anything new. But there is also, when you look at those obscene adverts by the American concrete industry to prevent the legislation changes that allow mass timber construction, and they ran adverts of a burnt children's toy saying, if you vote in favor of this, I hope you can stand the heat, which is unbelievably disgusting and inaccurate. So I don't know to what extent hemp has been afflicted by that kind of thinking, but certainly the general picture is one of multi-billion-dollar industries not lying down very, very willingly when people realize that they're causing problems.
Yeah, definitely.
And we should probably be offering them compensation, because they started out doing something legal and not known to be immoral, and we need to fully dismantle them. So we should probably be offering them compensation. I would be thoroughly open to that, but they just need to stop doing what they're doing.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks for that question, John. Moving on to Tom, who is asking, insurance, regulation, culture, commerce, etc., all affect the viability and likelihood of more natural circular construction. It's kind of carrying on from what we were just saying. Where do you think the weak spot might be if we are to effect change? I don't know if that's some sort of anarchy thing that's suggested thereby, but where's the weak spot of the current situation?
Well, the weak spot is if enough people care, because it's incredibly simple to understand how wrong we're doing it at the moment. But we know what the right options are in many ways. So the challenge is to get enough people to know and care about it to produce a momentum to change. And when you tell people things like the fact that for the 40,000 tons of carbon that the replacement M&S on Oxford Street will cost to the moment where its doors open, if you put that in terms of people's individual actions, then if you move to having cold showers every day to save that much carbon, you would have to have daily cold showers for 680,000 years.
Right.
And when you tell people that, it suddenly makes sense that we should maybe do something about our waste.
Just keep the building. Yeah. So are you getting into these calculations, and you're doing a lot of them, I think?
Yeah, well, it's a quantitative problem, and I'm a historian, and I gave up maths as soon as I could at school, and I'm regretting it and trying to scrabble my way back into understanding it, because it's a problem of numbers.
Yeah, and you're right, when you quantify it, it does really help instantly understand it. So we've got another question here from Lloyd, who says, to what extent has globalization and or technological advancement impacted on the use of natural materials?
I think enormously. Yeah, it's an energy thing. That the definition of a natural material is a bit fuzzy anyway, of course, but by and large what I've been using as a definition today is that cheap energy means that you process materials more and more, and you bring them further and further because it becomes cheap to do so, and at that point that completely changes the material palette. Particularly the fact that labor gets more expensive in industrial societies as energy gets cheaper, heat energy gets cheaper through fossil fuels, and therefore the substitution is for heat, fossil fuel heat, to substitute labor wherever you possibly can, and that's what's landed us in our situation.
Can I just extend that slightly and ask, to what extent do you think the patriarchy and colonialism is responsible for what we're experiencing today?
Well, I think it's all combined, but the thing that complicates a kind of simple social reading is that the agrarian world was much worse in those terms, but much more sustainable. So it's not a simple relationship. In fact, the existence of an alternative to the patriarchy in a non-hunter-gatherer sense arises with intense fossil fuel consumption. So it's been socially enormously liberalizing and freeing, even as it's been very damaging in other ways. And one of the challenges is to move to environmental sustainability, move backwards in some ways in environmental terms, whilst not moving backwards in social terms. And that is obviously utterly vital, because we want to have a life that's humanly worth living.
Yeah. I'm being asked to maybe ask only another question, and any other questions that we have, we could perhaps ask you to answer in your own time. But are you okay for another couple? Or
yeah, I'm fine. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Right. So Mike is asking. Well, it says you did seem to take against air conditioning in identikit hotels, but in a heating climate, at least aircon, brackets as air-to-air heat pump, is likely to be absolutely the best solution to maintain an indoor air temperature. So one natural solution, namely burning a non-fossil fuel like wood, would be catastrophic for air quality. I think you'll agree, but some high tech is actually good, and it needs to be made more clear, in my opinion.
So the challenge here is to work out where air conditioning is genuinely necessary, and the answer is in hot, humid climates where it's extremely difficult to produce conditions for human health in an extreme condition of humid heat, because there's almost nothing other than air conditioning that's ever been able to improve that. So in those conditions, then air conditioning enough to mean that you produce conditions for human health is necessary and appropriate. In no other conditions is air conditioning an appropriate response. A heat pump in cold conditions, so basically air conditioning reversed, is also a good option if it's run off renewable electricity. There are still problems with them though, because with all of the heat pumps for cool and heat, which is partly that the gases in them are incredibly intense greenhouse gases, and they leak over time, or that's a very common fault for them to leak, and they undo all the good they've done extremely quickly once they spring a leak, and they cost a lot of carbon to install. So high technology options, you need to know exactly why they're necessary. You need to know that you're not installing them because of a shallow cultural preference or an assumption of a cultural preference for for a very limited range of temperature, when in fact we could just get used to a much wider range of temperatures and save a hell of a lot more carbon than we would by just trying to decarbonize our electric heating and cooling. So my hostility to them is largely genuine, not a misspeaking.
Comfort's coming up a lot, which is quite interesting. I'm sorry, I didn't catch the last bit that you said because I started talking over you. What was the last thing?
No problem. I was just saying that my hostility to air conditioning is therefore mostly not me misspeaking, it's genuine.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. Okay, so Margaret is asking, is there any point in attempting to retrofit buildings that were designed in complete negligence of the need to conserve energy? And if not, should we be developing analysis like passive house planning package, which permits the modelling of ways of retrofitting, the cost of renovating it, and deciding if keeping the old building is worthwhile? This could be the criteria for demolition and replacement, but rebuilding is very costly. But also keeping and using is also very costly. So from a historian's perspective, what do you feel the answer might be?
Yeah, it's case by case, but some combination of a really well-conducted independent life cycle carbon analysis of replacement versus retention is a really good tool for working out what you should do. But the downside of replacement is that even if the replacement is very low carbon in operation and relatively low carbon in construction, its carbon cost is upfront, and upfront is the most damaging place for it. And the grid is increasingly decarbonizing in many countries at least. So if you use increasing amounts, a fairly large amount of electricity use will become less and less carbon intense over time. So rebuilding is not very often the best option, and retrofit is incredibly versatile if you have good designers. They can retrofit almost anything to perform very, very much better. And there are brutalist buildings that have been retrofitted to passive house standard without destroying their architectural quality. You can retrofit almost anything to make it a massively better version of itself in terms of energy performance. So I would say that replacement is a last resort, usually for circumstances where the existing building is structurally flawed to the point where it simply can't, where it won't last more than another few years anyway. Which is vanishingly rare in this country because everything's been so strongly built for decades, centuries.
I'm just going to switch the questions around because Charlene's asked, which kind of follows on from this. She says, thanks for the talk. What's your position on how to balance retrofit with building conservation as a historian?
Yeah, it's a really tricky one. It's the conservation movement is coming to terms with the fact that it's got a huge support from the need not to demolish so much, but also a huge challenge from the fact that everything needs some level of retrofit, or almost everything needs some kind of retrofit, and that offers the enormous challenge of how you insulate buildings that were designed without it. Internally or externally, it tends to make an enormous difference to the appearance of the building. So personally, I would put solar on every roof of more or less everything, irrespective of aesthetic effect, because it will come back off again if we ever get to the point where we can afford to take it back off again. And I don't care about the aesthetic effect of the roof enough. So that would be one easy win. But in terms of insulation, it's a judgment of Solomon thing, and it depends on the individual building, and it depends on the extent to which there are other things you could do, like moving to heating people rather than heating space, because a lot of our buildings are wasteful because we're now heating them, or because they were designed in a period where we heat them entirely right the way through all the air inside, rather than trying to heat the people in them the way that people did in pre-fossil fuel contexts.
Great. Okay, there are two more questions and then we will wrap up. So Anya says, thank you for an incredibly inspiring talk. Anya, you should get his book if you haven't, because it's a great read. Which materials in England do you think will lead the ecological transition?
Really good question. I think stone's huge, has huge untapped potential. Timber is very slow growing, and the timber we've been growing for decades now is terrible quality and very difficult to build with. So to get enough timber going to build with local timber is going to be slow and problematic. But the stone you can scale up very quickly, and you can move entirely to electric vehicle production as well, potentially, and therefore decarbonize it as the grid decarbonizes, and, you know, extract stone on sunny days or windy days, so that you're using entirely renewable, spare renewable energy. So I think stone has huge potential. I think existing buildings are the biggest building source of building materials. You just work with what's there, unless there's a very, very strong reason not to. And
I thought you might have talked about insulation as an answer then, rather than stone, because stone's suggesting new build.
Yes, well, I'm sorry, I thought the question was about what.
It is. I mean, it is.
Yeah.
It's just open. I was just in my mind, I was thinking insulation rather than new
Yeah.
build. Interesting.
Yeah, no, I mean, in insulation context, then obviously trying to use low carbon, natural, recyclable or rottable insulation is a great challenge, and there's various competitors for that. But yes, in terms of new build, I would say stone.
Stone, and then maybe, I mean, get the timber growing simultaneously.
Yeah, and maybe bamboo as well.
Only stone, bamboo here.
Well, maybe via importation, because it's relatively light. But see how close we can grow it, and then bring it, because it's very, very good.
Right. Okay.
Very strong and very quick to grow, so that it sequesters carbon and grows very quickly. Yes, straw, somebody's pointing out, and you're quite right that straw is an underrated material. Earth potentially, but you need to detail it quite carefully in order not to have to add loads of cement to it in this climate, because for now at least we're still a quite wet country. But earth in drier countries, or in places where you can detail it so that it doesn't get water running down it.
Yes. Okay, we Owen's added another question, so we'll go with Annette and Owen, and then I think we'll stop. So Annette is asking, does the global north have a higher responsibility towards finding better energy efficient solutions, as historically they have been responsible for the majority of greenhouse emissions, which has significantly contributed to the global climate change?
Yep.
So it's our mess. Is it our responsibility to
yeah, it's our mess, and we're still richer than most of the world because of it, and therefore on both grounds, even if it weren't our mess, the fact that it's a worldwide problem and we have more resources to deal with it, in terms of both research resources and just average, national wealth, we should be dealing with more of it for that reason. And yes, we, particularly in this country where we started it all, and then profited from its colonial, the strength that it gave to our empire militarily and politically and economically, then yes, obviously it's a no-brainer that we made the mess, and we should be doing an awful lot more than we are to clear it up. And it's shameful that the flood homeless of Pakistan are doing far better than the Bloomberg headquarters building with a budget of £1 billion at decarbonising.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Right. Okay. Owen says, I think you forgot my question. We've got it here, Owen. So this is the last question. Owen says, last year I read your book, Raw Concrete. I'm a huge fan of brutalist design for its boundless optimism and utopian ideals, but it's clear that it is inappropriate for our current understanding of the climate crisis. Are there any natural materials as endlessly shapeable as concrete? I'm thinking of a building such as the Hermit's Castle in the way that the concrete is simultaneously the structure, the finish, and the furnishings.
Probably not, but this is the. I mean, there are lots of exciting potentials in non-concrete materials, but the issue here is that change always happens via people trying to swap things here and there, and actually, what's needed in this scale of change for new buildings is a rethinking on the basis of the materials. So the first generations of buildings using steel and concrete look like older brick buildings and older stone buildings and so on, and don't catch up at all quickly to the idea that the buildings should look totally different or could look totally different thanks to the new materials. And in the same way, at the moment, our so-called sustainable buildings are mostly modernist buildings with a few tweaks. And what's actually needed is a much more fundamental rethinking based on a kind of the best things about brutalism are the ways in which they take the changed conditions of their moment and forge them into exciting and appropriate and beautiful architecture. And we need to do that with sustainable materials. And it's an even more exciting challenge because brutalism is the same stuff everywhere in the world. It's just a question of whether the air conditioning plant or the heating plant is bigger on the roof, but otherwise they're basically the same everywhere. Whereas sustainable architecture, truly sustainable architecture from local natural materials and passively dealing with local climate is different in every context around the world. And so everywhere needs its own Le Corbusiers to emerge to turn these extraordinary exciting varieties of resources and needs into beautiful, compelling, appropriate, well-functioning to realistic levels of expectation architecture that people will love and want more of and want to keep and be able to adapt as time goes on and needs change. And that is a thrilling challenge as the world comes to realize that it's worth employing good designers to do it.
So it's suggesting a new aesthetic, which is really exciting. And I'm
lots
I'm going
lots and lots.
I'm going to kind of like wrap up here really, but to kind of end then, perhaps you're talking about a growing cult of permanence, but maybe we have a growing cult of impermanence. Which doesn't kind of make sense, but the sense that we're more interested in care and comfort. We look at comfort and care in a different way and develop.
Maintenance is something we need to lose our fear of, and replacement is something we need to become much more afraid of. So buildings that remain operative for centuries, if they remain in use and maintained steadily and gently and in a low carbon fashion, and otherwise they can gently go back into nature or be taken apart and used elsewhere. That's a component. But the current thing that you build with a pretense of permanence, but with temporary materials that are enormously carbon hungry to produce and very hard to recycle or dispose of at the end of life, which comes much sooner than people tend to realize, is self-evidently deranged.
Yeah, maintenance is everything, isn't it? It's all about that. Right, so well, thank you very much for coming. It's been really lovely to see you. I'm going to pass over to Andy, who's going to wrap up and talk about the party bag that we send out after every event.
Yeah, thank you very much, Barnabas and Anna. And thank you to everyone for coming. It's been a real pleasure. Just quickly wrap up to let you know that firstly, we'll be continuing our series of natural materials events throughout 2023. So please join us